Okay, this is the first video in a series where we're going to talk about the structures and the anatomy of trees. So in this video, we're going to talk about leaves, right? Leaves are the food-producing structures of trees. So this is where photosynthesis happens. This is where sugars are produced, which is then the raw material that's used for all sorts of processes in trees. This is a picture of a leaf from an American elm tree. A fully mature American elm will have as many as 5 million leaves in the canopy. It varies a lot from species to species how many trees there are, but we're talking about hundreds of thousands to millions of leaves. A very important structure for plants. Okay, so of course the most important thing happening in the leaves is photosynthesis. Now we could talk in a lot of detail here about how photosynthesis occurs within chloroplasts inside the cells of the leaves. We could talk about chlorophyll and the series of reactions that happen during photosynthesis, converting that solar energy into chemical energy. But at this stage, we really just have to know the basics here. So if we look on the left, here's just a little cartoon of a leaf and all the things that are happening. So number one, trees have to hold their leaves in a way to intercept sunlight. We have to bring water into the leaf, so that it comes in through the vascular tissue, through the veins, and that has to come all the way up from the soil through the roots. Trees can take up some water directly through the leaves, or some species can, but most of that water is coming up from the roots and through the stem. And then we have to have gas exchange, so carbon dioxide has to come in through the pores in the leaves, through the stomata, so we can bring the sunlight, the water, and the CO2 together to do photosynthesis. Trees also respire, so they do respiration. That also happens in the leaves, and oxygen has to diffuse in from the atmosphere. CO2 diffuses out, and water vapor comes out. I should mention that a byproduct of photosynthesis, of course, is oxygen, and that diffuses out during photosynthesis as well. Okay, let's talk about basic leaf structure. Leaves can be either simple or compound. With a simple leaf, we have a leaf stalk or the petiole, which is sort of this part that attaches from the twig to the leaf blade or lamina. The way to tell whether you have a simple leaf or whether you have a leaflet that's part of a compound leaf is look for the axial bud. So most trees will have a little axial bud here that's in the axis between where the leaf meets the twig. So over here on a compound leaf, again, we see an axial bud down here. Here's the petiole. And then the stem of the leaf, or the part of the leaf where leaflets attach, is called the rachis. And then each lamina of the compound leaf is called a leaflet. Another important thing to think about when trying to identify leaves is the leaf margin. So over here on the left, we have what we call an entire leaf margin. This is from a magnolia. And so you see the edge of the leaf is very smooth. You can also have a serrate or a toothed leaf margin, like in this linden. You can see teeth there. Leaf margins can also be lobed, like this white oak leaf. And you can see these lobes here. The parts of the lamina that stick out are called lobes, and the parts inside that are sort of missing, those are called sinuses. For compound leaves, there's sort of different ways that a leaf can be compound, depending on the arrangement of its leaflets. So over here we have a buckeye on the left, and we call this palmately compound. The leaflets are arranged sort of in a whorl or in an arrangement kind of like the fingers on the palm of your hand, right? So palmate. Here's a black walnut in the middle, and this is called pinnate leaf arrangement. So we have a single, down here is the petiole, and then we see the leaflets are kind of opposite each other coming off. You can have either odd or even pinnate. So if we had another leaf at the tip here, maybe like an ash or something like that, there'd be an odd number of leaflets. This walnut has an even number. And then you can have bipinnate. So right, again, here's the petiole. And then we have another little, another rachis coming off here. And so those are opposite each other. And then we have all the little leaflets coming off of there. So bipinnate. Another thing with hardwoods is to look at leaf arrangement. So how the leaves are held on the stem. And the most typical ways that you'll see leaves on the stem in trees is alternate or opposite. So with alternate, we can see the leaves are, one comes off the stem one direction, and then further along the twig, we have a leaf coming off in the opposite direction, in a different direction. Don't confuse that with opposite. Opposite, we see that we have a pair of leaves coming off the stem in the same place in two different directions, and we can see the two axial buds right there. Maples, this is clearly a maple leaf. Maples are one of the most common trees with opposite leaf arrangement. Now conifers, we have slightly different structures and slightly different things to look at. In general, conifers can have leaves that are scale-like. So these very, very small leaves here in the upper left. This is Rocky Mountain juniper, and you could see on the twigs you have these little scales. All right, these little scales are the tiny, tiny leaves. In common juniper, over here, those leaves are a little more awl-like or sort of pointy in shape. And then we can have sort of needle-like leaves, which is usually what we think of with conifers. So here we have a Douglas fir in the lower left, and those are needles that are attached to the twig singly. And over here in the lower right, here's a pine. This is eastern white pine, and those needles are attached to the twig in bundles. Over here under needle-like, again, you can see a drawing of a pine, and those bundles are held together with a short piece of shoot material called a fascicle. And remember, our pines are either arranged in groups of, the needles are in bundles of 5, like our white pines. Our yellow pines are more commonly in groups of 2 or 3. There are the occasional pines that have single needles. And then with our needles that are attached singly, like Douglas fir and pine and spruce and hemlock, those needles can kind of whirl around the twig and come off in all directions, or they can be more flat and having basically pairs of needles coming off opposite each other, or they can be sort of J-shaped and come kind of upward from the twig. So that's the arrangement of conifer leaves. Okay, so let's talk about leaf structure. So in general, this is a diagram of what leaves look like. So we have a layer of cells that are tightly packed together on both the top and bottom side of any leaf. This is a hardwood leaf, or an angiosperm leaf. And we can see that that's called the epidermis. So we have an upper and lower epidermis on the top and bottom of the leaves. We have usually covering the epidermis is this waxy layer called the cuticle. And different species will be more or less waxy, but again, that's to prevent water loss from the cells and from the intercellular space. And then inside the leaf, we have basically sort of 2 layers of what we call mesophyll, the cells in the middle of the leaf. Usually on the upper surface, we have what's called palisade mesophyll because they're tightly packed together like logs in a wooden fence or a palisade. And that's to pack all these little chloroplasts. You see all these little dots here. Pack these chloroplasts up towards the surface of the leaf where they're going to get the most sunlight. Lower down toward the middle of the leaf, the interior, we have what's called spongy mesophyll. And so those cells have fewer chloroplasts per cell, and the cells are farther apart. There's a lot more intercellular space. And basically the role of this part of the leaf is to this is where gases can exchange through the stomata, and then basically maintaining a humid atmosphere with a bunch of CO2. Speaking of the stomata, so down here, usually on the lower surfaces of leaves, although some species will have stomata on the upper surface or both surfaces, you have the stomata and the guard cells. So this is basically cells that can be opened and closed to allow gas exchange into the interior of the leaf and out to the atmosphere. And then, of course, in the veins of the leaf, these are our vascular cells. So these are the cells that are connected to the stem and all the way down to the roots. And there's two types of cells. There's the xylem, which are the cells that bring the water up from the roots. So mostly what's happening there is transport of water from the roots up to the leaves. And then we have phloem, which are cells that connect, that bring the photosynthate, the raw materials produced in the leaves, down to other parts of the tree. And here's just another illustration of the same thing. So here's a cross-section from under a microscope of a broadleaf angiosperm. And so again, we see the tightly packed cells of the epidermis. We can see the vascular bundle, the xylem, and the phloem. And then we can see the mesophyll and see how that mesophyll is sort of tightly packed along the upper surface of the leaf, and it's much more open down here. Down in the lower section here, we can really see the guard cells and the stoma right there. In a conifer leaf, we can see some differences. So here's a cross-section of a pine needle. If we look at the upper left, we can see the epidermis is very thick and very dense indeed. Again, we see the vascular bundle. In most needle-like conifer leaves, there's a single sort of vascular bundle that goes through down the middle of the leaf, down the middle of the needle. And then we can see how tightly packed and dense the mesophyll is on the outside, right? That would make this leaf really dark green. There's a lot of cells and a lot of chloroplast packed in there. Over here in the upper right, we can see the stomata here, and they're sunken down in pits. So we can see the epidermis, and then there's a little depression, a little pit, and then the stomata down there. That helps prevent water loss. So conifers have a couple of mechanisms to prevent water loss. Number one is they're usually very, very waxy, very thick cuticle on needles. And number two, the stomata are sunken down in there so that as air moves across, you don't have quite as much evaporation from the stomata. But in general, you can see compared to the hardwood leaf, there's a lot of stuff packed in here, right? It's a lot of biomass. It's a big investment. It's a big metabolic investment to grow a leaf. A needle like this, which is why these are not disposable, and trees will hang on to conifers that are evergreen, typically hold on to their needles for around 10 years, up to 10 years, and sometimes much longer in extreme environments. So we've talked about water loss, and this is the eternal struggle for trees, right? So it's the balance of photosynthesis and water loss. So photosynthesis is super important, have to generate sugars, mostly in the form of sucrose, produced by photosynthesis, and those sugars are then used to build everything else in the tree, not only for the energy that the plant needs, but also you need to grow all the parts of the tree, so starches and cellulose. All of these things are built from those sugars that are produced by photosynthesis. Those sugars are combined with molecules, with minerals that come in through the roots to produce everything else, right? Lipids and oils and fats. All the structures of the tree has to be formed by photosynthesis. So super important. Don't want to limit photosynthesis. But on the other hand, also want to prevent water loss. And trees lose a lot of water through their leaves. As it says here, a canopy tree in a tropical rainforest, as long as you have enough water, right? If there's soil water, like in a rainforest, if there's evapotranspiration off the surface of those leaves, high temperatures, direct sunlight, wind, all of those sorts of things that you see in a canopy, you lose a lot of water. So a rainforest tree can lose up to 1,200 liters of water per day. That's a tremendous amount of water moving up through these trees and out into the atmosphere. More typically in temperate regions like North America, trees are going to lose anywhere from 20 to 400 liters per day. And of course that can be mitigated under drought conditions. Trees will lose a lot less because they start implementing some some water loss strategies. One way that trees can prevent water loss is by closing their stomata. Right, so we could see here's a diagram of a stoma, and so those pores open. If water is pumped into those guard cells, it pushes them open and opens the pore. If the tree moves water out of the guard cells, then the stoma will close. Of course, with the stoma closed, most plants can't do photosynthesis because you're not getting carbon dioxide in there, and that's the basis of the carbon. So it's a very delicate balance. Now, water loss isn't all bad either. Trees need to lose water from their stomata because they need the flow of water to keep moving up from the roots through the stem. And one of the ways to do that is to create a negative water potential. So you have to be evaporating water off of the leaves to draw more water up through the stem. The other thing that's good about water loss is it keeps the leaves cool. The evaporation from the surface of the leaves helps keep the leaves cool, especially in the upper part of the canopy, where you're in a lot of direct sunlight. There's a lot of heating. So again, it is a balance. Besides closing stomata, other ways that trees can prevent water loss, of course, is with that waxy cuticle, and that especially prevents water loss from the cells themselves. So trees can lose water not only out through the stomata, but also through the cells themselves, and so the waxy cuticle helps prevent that. Some trees will have hairs, so very, very fine hairs, and what that does is will prevent air. It will slow down the air moving across the surface of the leaf, and so that slows down the amount of evaporation that happens across the surface of the leaf. And then trees can also change the angle of their leaves through the day. And so to avoid direct sunlight, it can keep the leaves cooler and have less evapotranspiration happening than if they were facing the sun directly. Now, at different parts of a tree canopy, leaves will experience very different conditions. And so we typically see a difference between leaves that grow in the shade, in the bottom of a canopy, versus leaves that are grown in the sun at the top of the canopy or the outside of a canopy. So sun leaves are typically thicker. So here's in the upper left here, this is a cross section of a sun leaf, a leaf that was grown in the sun. And you can see it's thicker, it's got more cells, and it's got more chloroplast per cell, which is why it shows up as darker in this image. And so it's more efficient if your leaves are growing in a place where they're getting consistent sunlight. It's more efficient to pack that full of photosynthetic machinery, right? Put lots of cells, lots of chloroplasts, and try to do as much as you can. Now, the thicker leaf means that the cells down here in the interior aren't getting as much light as the cells out here close to the edge, but still, it's more efficient to have those leaves packed full of cells because of less water loss. Per unit water loss, a leaf with a certain number of stomata will still be more efficient in terms of water loss than a thin leaf down here. So down here, this is a shade leaf. You notice it's thinner, it has fewer cells and fewer chloroplasts. Because again, you don't want to pack that leaf full of a bunch of, you don't want to invest all that energy into building a leaf that's going to mostly be in the shade. So in the bottom of the canopy or the interior of the canopy, you'll see shade leaves versus sun leaves. The other difference is shade leaves are also, you tend to be bigger, so they're thin but they're broad. And again, that's because they're not getting exposed to as much sunlight, they're not getting as much heating, so there's less, and they're exposed to less wind, so there's less moisture demand on them. So you can have a big flat area with more stomata. A sun or canopy leaf will be shaped a little bit more like this. If it's a tree with lobes, it's going to have it's going to be more lobed. There's going to be more sinus spaces, and again, that's to avoid water loss. In the conifers here, again, we see typically the same shapes in sun versus shade leaves. But again, conifers have these sunken stomata, very thick waxy cuticles, to prevent water loss. Okay, now there's different strategies for leaves in terms of being deciduous or evergreen. Right? So we talked about deciduous are leaves that are on the tree for less than 1 year, and that's typically in trees that have a growing season and a dormant season. And evergreen are leaves that stay on the tree all year. And typically we find this sort of, you can think of this as we go from left to right across the slide. You can think of that as sort of a axis of stress. So if you're over here on the left, if you're in the tropical rainforest and you don't really have any difference between your growing seasons, there's always plenty of moisture and there's always adequate temperatures for photosynthesis, we see mostly evergreen leaves, right? So we have a lot of hardwoods, we have a lot of angiosperms, and they keep their leaves for more than 1 year. They'll typically lose leaves over, a leaf might last anywhere between 2 and 5 years. It depends a lot on the species and the conditions and so on. But if you're in a place where there's a distinct growing season and dormant season, or a place where the conditions are unfavorable for growth. So in the temperate regions where it's cold, like you think of in North America, in Mediterranean regions where it's just too dry in the summer, and so your growing season is in the winter, or if you're in the tropics in a place where you have a rainy season and a dry season, trees will lose their leaves, and again, they'll lose their leaves in the dormant season, and again, that's a strategy to prevent water loss. If you can't photosynthesize and you're not getting any water, you're going to lose a lot of water through the leaves, so it's better to drop them. And so that's what we see here. Here's a red oak growing in Europe. And again, we have a distinct dormant and growing season. But as things get more harsh, we start to see more conifers. So here we see an Engelmann spruce in the mountains of the western U.S. And with Engelmann spruce and with sort of conifers that start to reemerge in more harsh environments, either things are really dry, or you're really nutrient poor. So if you don't have a lot of, say, nitrogen in the soil, and you have to regrow leaves, if you were deciduous and you had to grow new leaves every year, if you don't have a lot of nitrogen, you can't build those leaves, and so it's better to just try to invest in putting out a evergreen leaf and hang on to it for a while. And then also, if you have a really, really short growing season, so at high elevations and in high latitudes, if we have a really short growing season, if you have an evergreen leaf ready to go, as soon as temperatures and moisture are adequate, you can jump right into photosynthesis. So we start to see more evergreen species in those harsh environments until you get really harsh. So over here we can see a Siberian larch. So if you're at like Arctic tree line or someplace with a very, very, very short growing season and very difficult conditions, maybe you can't grow leaves that can survive that really harsh dormant season. If it's super cold, if there's lots of abrasion from wind and snow, it's better, again, to grow really fast, really disposable leaves. So if a tree is deciduous and it loses its leaves, it produces disposable leaves that are just going to be working for one growing season, throw them away, and then grow new ones. First, there's a period of senescence. And so senescence, we can see this clearly in a lot of trees when we see fall colors. So here we have some sugar maple growing on the shore of one of the Great Lakes. And the reason we're seeing those colors is because a lot of the chlorophyll is being taken back into the tree. So any chemicals, any compounds that are useful in those leaves can be broken down by enzymatic activity and shunted back into the tree for storage and use at a later time. And many species of trees are really good at this. They can recoup about 99% of the nitrogen, of the phosphorus, sulfur, iron, carbon. Lots of stuff that goes into those leaves can be taken back out. When we see fall colors, what we're seeing is the chlorophyll draining away, and then we're seeing some of the other pigments in the leaves. We'll talk about that in more detail later on in the course. And then once that process happens, that usually happens over about 2 weeks or so in many species. Once that process is finished, then abscission happens, and so that's the dropping of the leaves, and that's an active process. If you've ever picked up a broken branch during the growing season with the leaves still attached, or you prune the branch off, those leaves can die and dry out, but they're still really stuck on the twig. You can really shake that branch, and you have to really work to pull them off. So abscission is actually an active process of trees dropping their leaves. And the way abscission works is we have at the base of each leaf, we have what's called an abscission zone, which you can see in this diagram right here. So here's the base of the leaf, and you can see the axillary bud right there. And so we have a whole bunch of cells right through here, and those cells don't really have much lignin in them. Lignin we'll talk about when we talk about shoots, but this is the substance that really makes things sort of, it makes plant material sort of woody and stiff. And you find it in a lot of plant cells, but not in the abscission zone. And then the glue, the compounds that hold those cells together, can be broken down. That can be strengthened or weakened depending on different plant hormones that are sent to the leaves. So if you have a plant hormone called auxin, can make that glue more sticky and hold the leaves on, and a plant hormone called ethylene can be sent and basically weaken that. So after the period of senescence, when the materials are recouped from the leaves, then that abscission zone is weakened, and basically the only thing holding the leaf on there would be the vascular tissue. So then those leaves typically fall off, either blown off by the wind or kind of forced off with frost and things like that. If you've ever been outside in an area with deciduous trees, after a frost, that next morning there's usually a lot of leaves off there because water will get in there and the ice crystals will expand and pop those leaves off. Now in some species, abscission is really interesting in that different parts of the tree will have sort of different levels of leaf abscission. So this is a picture of some sugar maples. And sugar maples are kind of known for this. In the fall, the leaves senesce, you have beautiful fall colors, and then the leaves die. And then we have abscission usually in the top parts of the canopy. So up here, you can see there's not many leaves left on the top part of the tree. But in the bottom, maybe 2 meters or so of the canopy, we still have the leaves attached. And those leaves will typically stay attached until spring. A few species do this, and it's potentially unclear why. Some hypotheses are that, well, maybe the leaves stay on to protect some of the buds, so the buds don't get as much abrasion and things on them during the winter, and they're ready to go in the spring. Another hypothesis is that it's a way to recover some more materials from those leaves. So when the leaves fall on the ground, they typically are decomposed by fungi and bacteria and other microbes. And the microbes are the things that take the carbon and the nitrogen into their biomass. But if the leaves stay on the tree, they're under a lot less microbial attack. And then when those leaves fall down in the spring, there's a better chance that as the tree breaks dormancy, that the nitrogen and the carbon in those leaves are going to go into the roots and go back into the same tree. You can see this on our campus. There's some sugar maples on the main quad in front of Main Hall. There's sugar maples and red maples right next to each other. And if you look at those in the winter, you'll see the sugar maples have a lot of leaves still on them, especially on the lower part of the canopy, and the red maples are totally bare. So you can see there's a lot of different strategies on leaf abscission. Okay, so that's it for leaves. Make sure to review this stuff, and in class on Wednesday, where we're going to talk about one of the big questions I'd like you to answer is, why might a tree have compound leaves? So we talked about simple leaves and compound leaves. Under what conditions would it be advantageous to have compound leaves versus simple leaves? Okay, see everybody in class.